In this video, I'll be running through why e-commerce is such a difficult business model to scale. This is a really important video and concept to understand if you're an e-commerce brand owner or you're operating with an e-commerce business. It's also important if you're on agency side. This is an excerpt from one of our internal trainings. So if you are working on agency side and you want more content and training like this is a sneak peek into our 40 to 50 hour internal training program that you could have access to by applying for a performance marketer role in the description below. So firstly, majority of brands, particularly in the early days, are financing growth as it takes too long to grow with self-funded capital. And I want to explain this concept and show you why. So let's say that you start a new brand and you buy $10,000 worth of stock, and to sell that stock, you need to spend $5,000 on ads. And so let's assume you have a 2x markup on the stock. So this is $20,000 in revenue, $5,000 in ad spend. This would come out to a ROAS or an MER of a 4. Which is honestly quite aggressive in the early days with no proven product market fit and no existing brand presence. Hitting a 4 MER is kind of unlikely, but we're going to go for an extreme scenario here just to prove the point and say, hey, everything's going well and these guys are crushing it out of the gates. And they go and then sell all the stock for $20,000 worth. They now have $20,000 in cash. And the input over on the left was $15,000. And so it took $15,000 to start the company, assuming that they did everything themselves. There was no help on the website or anything. And now they've gone through this cycle and they have $20,000 out the other end. And then they go through this cycle again. And so you take your $20,000 in cash and you go and buy this time a little bit more stock. And so you buy $14,000 worth of stock and you spend a little bit more on ads because you need to sell more stock now. And so once again, let's say you maintain that 4 MER, which once again is pretty unlikely. It's likely that efficiency is going to drop as you start to scale in the early days, but let's say it maintains. You now, out the other side, have $27,000 in cash. Now, the reality here of these cycles is that this is probably about a 60-day cycle. So 10K a month in month 1, 10K a month in month 2. However, once you come to the completion of this first cycle, and you end up with, in the scenario that I showed before, $20,000 in cash. This isn't the point in which you buy more stock because you'll be out of stock. And then you have to wait however long it takes for that purchase order to go through, arrive to you so that you can start shipping more stock. And so you actually have to buy inventory for this next cycle well ahead of time, probably around about over here. And so that's what this now represents. So if we pull that buying of stock back from over here and we pull it 30 days earlier, you now actually only end up with 6K in cash in this position. And you need to go and start spending 7K on ads. And so you can start to see your cash position shrinking substantially within your actual bank account. And then you go through this next cycle, and once again, you get left with 6K in cash. And so your actual cash position, even though you put $15,000 into the business to begin with, is now sitting at $6,000 consistently within your bank account. So what ends up happening in most instances, particularly if you want to grow faster or you need to spend more on ads, and once again, we put a really aggressive MER in here. In reality, you're closer to a 2 MER for a new brand with no product market fit and no existing testing. And so this spend is likely closer to 14K. And so you're going to end up with no money left in this scenario, and the business is going to go bankrupt. And so what ends up happening in most instances is that you need to finance future inventory purchasing in some capacity by usually taking loans. That's either the option 1 or option 2 is you need to put a ton of cash into the business. And so consistently you need to keep fueling cash in to be able to continue to buy more inventory and spend more on ads. And we're not even including operating expenses here. Now, loans for inventory purchasing is very different from home mortgages. And I wanted to make this clear because of a few, simply because of the fact that when people think of loans, majority of the population is only familiar with home mortgages and that's it. Most people don't take loans outside of credit cards and mortgages. When it comes to company loans, there's really 3 main types. There's a few more, but they're uncommon. So these are really the 3 main categories that you can look at. I've put home mortgages in here as a reference point, but the first one that you have is business loans, and interest rates on a business loan or a company loan sit between 17 to 16%. And this is based on the risk profile of the business. The second is a merchant cash advance. And so this is similar to a credit card loan where you interest rates are exorbitantly high at about 35% all the way up to 350%. And so why would you ever get a cash advance when you can just get a company loan? The reason being is that if you're an early stage business, particularly the business that I just ran through here, this business would not be able to get access to a company loan. It is incredibly unlikely because they don't have a full financial year worth of finances to make a bank or a lender comfortable with providing a large amount of cash to be able to fuel future inventory and ad buying and trust that there'll be enough profit left over to actually pay them back. And so the only way that you really get a company loan is consistent financial documents over a consistent period of time that proves that it's a high likelihood that you will actually pay this down. And so you're likely left with a merchant cash advance, which has a massive interest rate tacked on it, which is going to further erode all of the profits that you are actually generating. Now, let's take the example of a business loan. And let's say that you have actually been established, you've been running for about 3 to 4 years, and you have trailing profits over that time period. So company A, and this is a real business that we actually work with, is targeting or was targeting to do $750,000 in revenue over the November to December period, which meant because they have a 3x multiple on their cost of goods in the way that they price, they have to buy about $250,000 worth of stock for this 60-day time period. Now, what that ends up meaning is that they have to go and get a $250,000 loan. Their interest rates is at about 20% on that loan. And that, quite frankly, freaks people out. It freaks people out when they have to take a $250,000 loan to be able to sustain inventory purchasing, to be able to sustain revenue. And it's very unlikely for most businesses that they have enough cash on hand, particularly if they're only a $4 to $6 million business that's been running for a few years, to be able to sustain such large, rapid growth in both ad spend, operating expenses, and inventory purchasing. And this ends up being an enormous stressor on, number one, being able to grow a company, as most people don't want to go to this extent to fuel growth. Or number two, if they do go through the process of taking overdrafts and loans to be able to fuel inventory purchasing, it places an enormous amount of stress on that business owner and the team. And if your agency side, it's important to understand that, particularly when heavy projections are being worked towards, which is likely being sustained through loans in some capacity. And so to actually break down what this would look like, you'd be sitting on about $4,200 in monthly interest repayments until that's paid down. Now, the reality is that this would actually be a great decision to make as long as there was a high degree of certainty in actually hitting these revenue figures, because you're going to likely pay this down within 60 days, maybe 90 days, depending on your cash conversion cycle. So you're going to take about an $8,000 to $12,000 expense, but it's going to facilitate the ability to do $750,000 in revenue. And let's say you're operating on an average 20, 25% EBITDA. The math makes sense. So it does actually make sense to take this loan, pay the interest required to get access to capital to be able to hit these revenue targets, but there needs to be an incredibly high degree of certainty that these revenue targets will actually be hit. Putting stretch targets in place and then taking on exorbitant interest fees that just drop straight into your operating expenses with a conventional P&L structure. Technically, it actually drops out of all buckets, but this needs to be heavily considered and understood. And it's one of the reasons why e-commerce as a business model is incredibly difficult, coming back to the title of this video, which is that your cash conversion cycle ends up completely restricting the growth of a business, and being able to effectively shorten a cash conversion cycle and manage operations across cash flow in a business that operates on such low margin and requires all net profits really to be distributed back into the company. You really can't pull dividends from an e-commerce brand, at least in the early stages for the first few years, if the goal is to grow month on month bootstrapped. And that ends up making the business model incredibly hard to get off the ground and working, because if you take no income from an e-commerce business for the first 2 years, you need an income from somewhere. So normally most operators of e-commerce brands within the first 2 to 3 years of operations have a full-time job, and the e-commerce business is on the side that they're trying to grow to a level in which they can switch over to operating within the e-com business. But it is a catch-22 of they could either move to the e-commerce business full-time, start taking dividends from the business, but then the business can't grow anymore, or they continue to allocate free cash flow to future inventory purchasing and high ROIC activities, but they can't actually switch into moving full-time into the business because it isn't generating any dividends. And so there is this there's this nuance in a lot of clients that we work with in which they are in this decision-making process of trying to figure out, do we start allocating free cash flow to dividends, or do we continue allocating cash flow into the growth of the company to the level in which we can be comfortable in generating dividends? And the answer to that question is very difficult. There is no answer. It's completely unique to you and exactly what you want to go and achieve with the company. But a disclaimer for anyone that's working at an agency watching this video and how this impacts you is that you need to be very careful with any kind of aggressive growth projections that you put in place, as the unforeseen consequences is that the client, likely majority of the time, has to go into large levels of debt to be able to facilitate the ad spend and inventory purchasing. And if you don't end up selling through, and going back to this example, if you don't end up doing $750,000 in revenue, and this was incredibly aggressive, and you actually did, let's say, $400,000 in a doomsday scenario, well, now you have maybe $100,000 left on this loan that you can't pay down because you don't have the free cash flow to facilitate. Or maybe alternatively, you can go and achieve the $750,000 in revenue generation, but you were projecting that you were going to do it at a 4 MER. But in reality, to hit those numbers, you actually had to substantially change the core KPI down to a 2.1 MER. And that 2.1 MER meant that you don't have enough free cash flow to be able to pay the loan down. And instead, all of the tiny amount of free cash flow that was generated had to be redistributed into future inventory purchasing. And so now you're sitting on this loan and this overdraft account that you can't actually settle on. So the reason e-commerce is such a hard business model is because of cash flow and how extended the cash conversion cycle is, and the fact that the cash conversion cycle does not start at the first point of ad spend. It starts at the first point of inventory purchasing.